On the banks of the Alabama River, there is a place that today is barely marked even on maps. No sign, no shop, not even a single light, just brick ruins rising among the trees. A few gravestones and the silent flow of the river. This place was once the capital of Alabama. In 1818, when it had just been established, a governor of the Alabama Territory, William Wyatt Bibb, chose the spot where the Cahaba and Alabama rivers meet as the future capital. An interesting detail: the land where the town would be established was on top of large earthen mounds left behind by Native American communities who had lived here centuries earlier. Bibb planned to build, in the future, on top of one of these mounds, a permanent, the historic state capitol building on one of these ancient mounds. When Alabama officially became a state in 1819, parcels of land in Cahaba were put up for auction. The results were incredible. Investors who paid $1.25 per acre were able to sell the same land for $70 just a few months later. By 1824, a single vacant lot in the city center was selling for $5,000, which is about $135,000 in today's money. Cahaba was standing on the threshold of a golden age. In the 1800s and 20s, a two-story brick structure and magnificent state capitol building was completed. The town grew rapidly. Hotels, 2 newspapers, a theater, a state bank, and a regular street grid were established. By 1821, the population had reached 1,000. At that time, it was even more populous than Montgomery, which is now the capital of Alabama. Then, it was larger than Montgomery, Alabama's capital. In 1825, the legendary French General Lafayette, the Marquis de Lafayette, visited Cahaba during his U.S. tour. Was a testament to the town's bright future. It was proof of the belief in the town's promising future. But there was a singularly strange flaw in Cahaba's fate. The town was built at the point where 2 rivers met on the lowest land in the region. The first major floods came in 1821 and 1822. Summer yellow fever epidemics occurred, and autumn rivers overflowed with heavy rains, flooding the town. The rivers, swollen by heavy autumn rains, inundated the town. The streets were submerged underwater. Houses were destroyed. Health problems described as bad air increased. Officials began to discuss moving the capital. The people resisted and rebuilt the town. But the problems did not end. On December 13, 1825, the Alabama State Legislature, by just a single vote, decided to move the capital from Cahaba to Tuscaloosa as well. Just 5 years after it was founded, Cahaba's days as the capital had come to an end. The population quickly dropped to as low as 300. Most of the town's leading families even dismantled their homes and moved them to cities like Mobile, Selma, and Tuscaloosa. But Cahaba didn't die completely. On the contrary, it surprisingly experienced a second golden age. In 1859, a railroad line was connected to the town, making it the center of the region's cotton trade, and helped it become the hub of this area's cotton trade. In the 1860s, the population once again reached into the thousands. Magnificent mansions were built, and the town became one of Alabama's wealthiest settlements. In fact, some of the state's first street gas lamps were installed here. Then the Civil War broke out. In 1863, the Confederate Army turned an old cotton warehouse into a prison camp to hold Union soldiers, transforming it into a POW camp, Castle Morgan. This building, designed to hold 432 people, by the end of the war, was housing more than 3,000 prisoners, 6 times the designed capacity. And the conditions were brutal. Poor nutrition, disease, and extreme overcrowding. But here's an interesting fact. The camp's commander, a Methodist minister named Captain Henderson, insisted on treating the prisoners in a relatively humane manner. As a result, the death rate at Castle Morgan was around 2 to 3%. Other famous Confederate camps of the period, much lower. But the real tragedy came after the war ended. March of 1860. Most of the prisoners released from Castle Morgan, she was put on the steamship Sultana to return home. the ship legally only, while it has a capacity to carry 376 people. There were over 100 people on it in 2003. April 27, 1860, at 5 o'clock near Memphis, the ship's boilers exploded. Approximately 1,800 people died. Hundreds of them were soldiers who had just been freed from captivity at Castle Morgan. This was the deadliest maritime disaster in American history, with a loss of life even greater than the Titanic. But because the incident happened just a few days after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, in the newspapers of that period, it found almost no place and remained in the shadows of history. After the war, after the 1865 flood, the county seat moved and Cahaba's commerce faded. He was freed during this period. Hundreds of former slaves were left behind in the abandoned state legislature building, which they used as a meeting place for political organization. By the 1870s, the population had dropped to just 400 people. By the early 1900s, most of the buildings had either burned down, collapsed, or been dismantled and moved elsewhere. Surprisingly, Cahaba was still officially considered a town, and it retained its status until 1989. This made it Alabama's longest-lived ghost town. Today, Cahaba, or as it was formerly spelled, Cahawba, is preserved as the Old Cahaba Archaeological Park. Visitors can walk among the brick ruins scattered throughout the forest, exploring between them. The foundations of the old statehouse, 3 separate cemeteries, only brick columns remain from what were once magnificent mansions. And this is exactly where the town's most famous legend begins, the Cahaba Light. Locals say that at night above the old cemetery, or among the ruins along the riverbank, a mysterious light floats through the air, moving on its own, and they tell of seeing a mysterious ball of light. Some believe that it is the spirit of a soldier who died here during the Civil War, perhaps a Confederate guard, or one of the 147 prisoners who died in Castle Morgan. Some believe it is the soul of a prisoner, while others say the light belonged to a local who drowned in the floods and whose body was never recovered, and that the light continues to search for them. There is also a scientific explanation for what the light might be: swamp gas, or a natural phenomenon known as will-o'-the-wisp. But those who claim to have seen it say that the way the light moves, how it stops and waits, how it approaches as if it's watching the observer and then moves away, doesn't resemble any natural phenomenon at all, according to the townspeople. Today, it stands as perhaps the most striking example, one province's first capital, 2 major disasters stuck in the middle, erased from history by a single vote, and now only trees remain, stones and one light gliding in the darkness, is remembered. The question that needs to be asked is this: who is that light really after?